through this careful planning, through a robust moderator's guide, we can lead to a useful and actionable report. And that is the end goal here, is to collect data in such a way that we can report on it and come out with action items, good action items for our clients, whoever they may be. And through this careful data collection planning, we can make sure that data is collected consistently across the participants, because we want to collect the same data if possible. Because in a typical usability study, we only have 8 to 12 participants. So we can't let any of that data slip by. We need to get as much of that data as possible. So by planning, we can make sure that that data doesn't slip by. And then the first tip here I have for you is about the moderator's guide, and it shouldn't be just about the tasks and questions. It should really convey both the goals of the study and how the data is going to be collected. And the whole process of writing the moderator's guide and putting it together with your coworkers and your stakeholders can really facilitate the conversation about study goals and how the study is going to proceed. So the whole process of writing the moderator's guide can be a very important part of the process. And again, the whole point of this is to make sure that data doesn't slip by. If we ask a question from only 3 out of 12 participants, that piece of data doesn't help anyone. We want to get that piece of data from all 12 participants. All right, so we're going to take a couple of steps here, and we're going to start with stakeholders and how we should talk to stakeholders and what should be done there. We'll move on to the prototype, and then we'll spend the bulk of the session in the moderator's guide and how that's put together and the best practices for that. So to give you something extremely obvious, to conduct a successful study, you have to know the goals and hypotheses of the study. And yes, this is insanely obvious, but it's really important to point out, because if you're not thinking about the goals and hypotheses of your study when putting together the moderator's guide, your data is not going to come out great. So to facilitate this, your first step is really to understand the business goals of the study. So why is this important? So we want to make sure that we're collecting data that stakeholders are going to find useful. And when I say stakeholders, I mean everyone involved with the project, be they different areas of the client business or coworkers or other teams, really anyone that is a stakeholder. So by understanding the business goals, we'll get at that right data. And we also want to validate that quote-unquote known user needs and wants are valid. Very often you go into a study and stakeholders say, oh, we know this about the users, we know that about the users, and they may have good data to back that up, but we want to make sure of that sometimes, so we can validate those known needs and wants. So the tip for you here regarding talking to stakeholders is it's a great practice to get stakeholders talking in the room at the same time. And when I say stakeholder interviews, I'm not talking about actual stakeholder interviews where you're spending an hour with each stakeholder and doing 12, 20 interviews, that sort of thing. I'm talking about getting stakeholder input into the study. So get everyone into the same room so that the stakeholders can hear each other's goals and wants and needs. And that way, once the stakeholders can hear each other's ideas, that way you can set your relative goal priorities. And that's really important because we have limited time in a usability study, and we want to prioritize everything, the goals, the questions being asked, and so forth. So by getting the stakeholders into the same room, you'll hear everything from them. You'll be able to you'll be able to determine priorities. And stakeholders can get on the same page when they hear each other talk. So when collecting stakeholder information, definitely get them in the same room talking if you can. Now, what are some of the questions that you could ask stakeholders when putting the guide together? So first off, and you'll notice in this first line I say website application interface. For ease sake, I'm going to refer to website for the rest of the session here. But really, a usability study could be on anything, website, an application, a phone, something physical. but for the sake of ease, I'll just be saying website from here on out. So first off, you need to find out what the business goals are for the website. How does this website impact the business? Because that way you can understand what tasks you should start figuring out and what paths of the website you should be going down. And then you want to find out what the business and what stakeholders want users to do on the website or application. What value are they getting out of it? And so that way we can hone in on the tasks that we need to do. And then finally here, what do the stakeholders want users to do on the site? And there could be a delta between what the users want to do and what the stakeholders want users to do. And that delta, the difference between what the stakeholders want, what the users want, can be a very important distinction. So asking that question up front and then validating with the users in the room can be very important. So some additional points about stakeholder questions. So participant demographics. The point of asking these questions is to build up a screener document. And a screener document is what we send over to the recruiters in order to get the right people as participants. Do they have this job? Do they have that experience? Are they within this demographic? That sort of thing. And we want to find out from the stakeholders who are the users of the website, of the interface, and who are those ideal people to bring in for the study. Now, all too often we'll hear from stakeholders that, well, everyone's the user of the website. We want everyone to use this, and that's not really helpful for the purpose of our study here. We want to have stakeholders think about those ideal users and think about what makes them ideal users. And you want to facilitate the conversation around that, really get down to the nitty-gritty of who they want using that website so we can figure out who to get into the room. And then the next point here is about the knowledge that participants need to have and how experienced with the website or concept they need to be. And the thing I want to stress here is the concept aspect of it. For complex interfaces, for complex websites, you want to make sure that the person has the right context and that we're bringing in the people with the appropriate roles. We've seen a brief anecdote here. There was one time a participant came in and was extremely adamant about not doing the task because it was something that not only would he not do at work, it was something he wasn't allowed to do at work. And it was basically a recruiting mix-up. But when you get the wrong person in the room, you never know what's going to happen. And this particular participant just wouldn't do the task. We had to mark it as a fail and move on. Even after much prodding to move along, just wouldn't do it. So you want to define these appropriate roles so that you get the right person in with the right experience. And also you want to find out, do they want current customers? Do they want prospects? That sort of thing. And then moving on to the probing questions. So what do the stakeholders want to know while they have a captive audience? And again, getting back to the prioritization, what are the must-haves? What are the nice-to-haves? So that when you're asking these questions, you can prioritize them. Sessions run long and questions don't get asked, and we want to make sure that we're asking the most important questions. So moving on to the prototype here. So we finished up with stakeholders. We have asked them who we're going to be bringing in, what's important to them, and what questions they want to ask. So now we have some good context from the stakeholders. Now it's time to get some context from the prototype itself. And there's really 4 reasons to look at the prototype before a study. There are some schools of thought that say, hey, you shouldn't look at a prototype before dreaming up the tasks for your moderator's guide, because it should be based on the goals of the study, not based on the prototype. In my humble opinion, that's not terribly real world. We want to take a look at the prototype to make sure it does what we think it's going to do, among other things. So the first thing here is the navigation structure. You want to know what the navigation structure is. How do you manipulate the prototype? And I'm saying prototype here, again, we could be testing a live site, we could be testing really anything. I'm just throwing prototype out there as an example. So what's the navigation structure? As the moderator, you need to be able to navigate that site with confidence. So understanding the navigation structure up front is very important, as is understanding what's in and out of scope. There may be some areas of the prototype that have nothing to do with the study that participants may try to go to. So we need to know when to wrangle in participants if they get off track a little bit. Known bugs are always inevitable during a prototype because prototypes sometimes aren't able to get fully built out before a study, more often than not. So we want to know what those bugs are in case the participants run into that. And then overall, the purpose of the prototype. Now, we have some background information from our stakeholder interviews, but with that context and with playing around the prototype, we'll get to understand the purpose that much more, and that's going to be very important because, again, as a moderator, we need to talk smartly about the prototype and the purpose of the prototype while in the room with the participant. And one note about the prototype in general. I think changing the prototype in the course of a study isn't necessarily the best idea, especially if we're doing a summative study at the end of a project. Because, again, going back to the consistent data point, we want to make sure that we're testing the same thing for all participants. All too often we see prototypes changing midstream, and that way we're not collecting consistent data. Now, of course, if you're doing a formative study at the beginning of a project and you're trying different interactions, or if something is miserably failing and hindering task completion, then yeah, make the change. But to get that consistent data, I would suggest not changing the prototype if you can. Why is this important? So there have been studies where sometimes we get the prototype either the evening before the study or the morning of, because sometimes prototyping comes down to the wire, and as usability folks, we need to be flexible with that. And so we can try to help alleviate that by, again, getting our hands on the prototype beforehand, if possible. And sometimes the moderator's guide and the prototype need to be scripted together. We want to make sure that the prototype does what we're expecting it to do, and we can get to the areas that we want to get to. All right, so we've talked about stakeholders and we've talked about the prototype itself, and those are really just the first two steps. Let's get into the meat of the issue here of the moderator's guide, because this is really what's going to get us collecting consistent data, or consistently collecting data, I should say. Now, you also may hear it referred to as the script. And it's really the key to collecting consistent data. And why is this? So it's a guide for the moderator and stakeholders, and for the moderator, it shows them what the tasks are and how the participants should accomplish them, what questions to ask and when, so there's that prioritization, and then important notes about manipulating the prototype. And that's really important because the moderator needs to be as expert as possible, so that goes back to knowing what's working, what's not working, how you need to manipulate the prototype in order to get it into a state where the participant can complete the task. And now the moderator's guide, by guiding the moderator during the study and having all of the questions outlined in explicit detail, it allows the moderators to have a nice casual conversation with the participants, but still stay on track of gathering all this right data. And this goes to the idea of building rapport with the participant. You want participants to be comfortable, and by building a rapport with the participant, you'll have them comfortable and hopefully more willing to give you good data, to chat about what they're doing on the site. And additionally, as I mentioned earlier, the moderator's guide is a great tool for working with stakeholders to clearly define that scope and the focus of the study. And by delineating out all the data we're going to capture, we can make sure that we're getting at the right goals and that we are collecting the data across the participants in a consistent manner. So digging into it, the typical moderator's guide structure, there's typically 6 sections to a mod guide, starting with the study overview and the schedule and conference information. You have your welcome and introduction, also known as your spiel, pre-study questions, the tasks, and the post-study questions. So 4, 5, and 6 are really the meat of the issue here. And so let's dig in a little deeper here. So the first portion is the study overview, and this is really just the introduction, as it were, where you're describing the overarching goals and description of the study, why we're doing what we're doing and how we're going to go about doing it. And then the schedule and conference call information, and this is more important than one may think, because this can encourage observation, especially if you're using some sort of screen sharing technology, such as WebEx or GoToMeeting, one of those things. Especially if observers can't make it to the lab for a live session, you want to encourage observation, because stakeholders are going to have context that the moderator is not going to have. And they may be jotting down notes that are important to them, and you can actually, I like to give observers Post-it notes if they are on site, so that way I can collect their data. But otherwise, if you have the screen sharing information in the moderator's guide, you'll inform possible observers that, hey, it's really easy to observe, just press this link and poof, you're in. So that's more important than you may think. And then the welcome and introduction, and this is basically a standard welcome and introduction that is typically copy and pasted from study to study. And it rarely varies, and with a few years of experience, you can do this in your sleep. And it describes the participants' rights, roles, and responsibilities. So it tells participants, that we're not studying them, that we're studying the prototype, that we're recording the session, that sort of thing. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to look at all of this in terms of a moderator's guide for Woot.com. And here are some screenshots from a mock moderator's guide. And let's just talk about what you're seeing here. So first off, the study overview. And you want to keep this concise because a mod guide can get pretty big pretty quick, and you want people to read it. You want to invite people to read it. And by having a 2-page study overview, no one's going to read it. So keep it concise. Tell people what you're aiming to do and how, and then move on. And then the study schedule and conference information. And don't forget to put the meeting number and the actual WebEx link. You want to make it as easy as possible for observers. And then putting in the participant information can be very helpful, because sometimes stakeholders want to see a specific type of demographic. So putting the participant information in here can encourage people to observe as well. And obviously having the schedule of time also helps, so people know when to observe. So moving on to the welcome and introduction, and again, this is typically copy and pasted from study to study. It rarely changes, but this is the top and bottom of that one page. Thank you for coming today. This is my name. This is my role, that sort of thing. Here are the goals, and so forth. And what I like to do is have a quick list at the bottom, because after years of doing this, there's no way I'll be reading this aloud, and actually listening to someone read a welcome and introduction word for word can actually be quite painful. It's a lot more natural when you do it off the cuff. And again, that goes back to participant comfort. So I typically include this quick list to make sure that I hit all the important points while doing an off-the-cuff introduction that I can probably do in my sleep at this point. So moving on to the pre-study questions, and here's where we're going to get into the meat of the moderator's guide. So if possible, use a questionnaire in the waiting room. You really don't want to inundate a new participant with questions right off the bat. You want to ease them into the testing experience if you can. And this way you save a little time, and you really want to, you have limited time with these participants. So while they're waiting, they can be answering some of your questions, and you can concentrate on the tasks while they're in the room. So questionnaires can be really helpful. Transcribing them can be a bit painful sometimes, but it's worth the time saving typically. So what are the purposes of the pre-study questions? Generally, You want to validate your demographics and make sure that the you have the right person in the room and then they have the experience needed. And then the amount of experience that the person has with the concept of the website or whatever will inform the moderator of how much guidance to give during those tasks. So why is this important? Because when you give hints during tasks, you are causing variation, and variation leads to inconsistent data. So by giving minimal hints, you can reduce that variability. Additionally, you want to learn their unbiased wants and needs before they're exposed to a prototype or an artifact of any nature. Learn what they want before they're biased. So it's a great opportunity to ask some questions right up front before they have a prototype in front of them. And overall, you want to constrain the scope of these questions. You want the users to stay on target. Narrow scopes deter tangents. Be very succinct and direct. And an initial broad question can build rapport and comfort. Let them talk a little bit about themselves if they feel comfortable doing so. Something that we see often is an initial question such as, tell me about your background, which is really open-ended and invites their life story. You ask, all right, tell me about your background, and they start with, well, first the earth cooled, and then the dinosaurs came, but they got too big and fat, and they start, rambling off for a while, and that's not really helpful for the study. So you want to constrain those. Those initial questions, if at all possible. So some examples of pre-study questions. So first off, tell me about your experience with this application or sites like it, and how often do you use it? This gets back to experience and understanding how much context the participants have. And then you can get at features. What do you do on these types of sites? What features do you like least and most? What annoys you? What delights you? And asking that negative question, actually, I don't see it getting asked enough. I like asking the negative question so that we want to know what's going to be great for them, but we also want to know what's really going to upset our users. So make sure you ask those negative questions. And on the bottom there are these open-ended, ineffective questions. How do you use this website? What do you want from this website? Completely open-ended, indirected, and not useful. So you really want to constrain your questions if at all possible. And again, this gets back to consistent data collection. By constraining the question, you're not opening it up to different stories and variation. You're just going to keep them on track and collect similar types of data across the different participants. It can be very uncomfortable sitting across from a participant after asking a very poorly worded question. You ask, how do you use this website? And they're sitting there thinking about it. Well, I click on things. That's how I do it. It can be very uncomfortable when that happens. So try to avoid it if possible. All right. So again, back to the mod guide. This is the background information, and you'll notice that I have times for each part. And again, we have a limited amount of time with participants, and we want to outline that time. So, all right, we're going to spend around 5 minutes on the background information, so we can spend the bulk of the time on the tasks. And so here's just again some examples that we may ask about Boot.com. How often do you make purchases online? Do you use deal sites? Have you ever visited Boot.com? Here we get into the experience aspect. And then the moderators note, like I mentioned earlier, these are really these aren't meant to be read. These are meant to guide the session as we go. And again, not too many questions. Only 5 questions here. Again, we want to spend the bulk of the time, if possible, on the tasks at hand, which are the most important. The tasks are the most important part of the usability study. And with that, let's talk about tasks. And this is the heart of the matter, because a well-written task will reduce variability and lead to consistently collected data. And that's the overall goal, is that we want to reduce that variation in how participants interpret what we're telling them, how they interpret the task, how they interpret the question, how the tasks are presented and explained, and then obviously on how the data is collected. We want to reduce that variation. And this can be best done through task relevance. Task relevance leads to fewer explanation, and an explanation introduces variability. And so how do we ensure relevance? By making participants empathetic towards the task. Give them that context. But along those lines, you don't want to feed emotions to the participants, and you don't want to get it too personal. So you want them to be empathetic, but not sad. Don't start off with, hey, your father just died, and so forth, because their father may have died last week. So don't feed emotions to people, and don't let it get too personal. If possible, say, a friend, that sort of thing, instead of you. Along the lines of reducing variation, we want to keep those explanations of the tasks the same. So that's why we want them well written. We don't want to explain that much, but if we do have to explain, try to explain it the same way across the different participants. And now, regarding non-leading tasks, essentially we don't want to give away the answer. But does this affect consistency? Well, maybe not. Thinking about this, and sure, you can have a non-leading task, or even a leading task, and collect the same data across participants. So I don't think non-leading tasks affect consistency per se. I just think it's just good usability practice. But overall, you don't want to overword those non-leading tasks. Sometimes you get an overworded task because you're beating around the bush and you're trying to not lead the participant directly to the answer. But sometimes we overword it and it just leads to confusion. An example would be we were trying to, again, not lead the participant to this one link, but it was a very specific link name. And we completely overworded the task and talking around the link name and using synonyms and everything under the sun to not tell them what the name of the link was. And the participant would read the task and just look up and be like, I have no idea what you're asking me to do. So really avoid that overwording, be leading without leading, but don't cause confusion. Oh, and one other point here, I'm sorry. My tip here is for writing scenarios instead of tasks. What's the difference? A task is the very direct thing, so go purchase a pen. The scenario is the context around that. So, your son is starting school next week, and he needs a pen, go buy it. It really provides that context and relevance. And again, you don't want to give away too much information. So scenarios provide that context, whereas tasks are a little bit more direct and they won't be as empathetic towards the task. So some tips regarding tasks and the moderator's guide in general here. Align your tasks with the study goals. This is very qualitative, very subjective, and we want to facilitate making sure that the tasks align with the goals. So the best way to do that, I believe, is to list the task goal for each task. On each page, so typically in a moderator's guide, each page is a different task with the task written out and the task condition and the questions. On that page, you want to list the goal. So because it helps to ensure that you're collecting the data that you think you're collecting. And also, as stakeholders read through the mod guide, they'll see why we're doing that task right there. It won't warrant further explanation, and that can help the whole conversation as well. And remember that the moderator's guide is as much for the moderator as it is for the rest of the team. We typically write out moderators' guides in such a way with lots of spaces so that moderators can print it out and take notes in it. But stakeholders, for the most part, aren't going to flip through a 15, 20-page document. We have to put the document together in such a way that it facilitates conversation with stakeholders. So what I like to do is put a consolidated list of tasks and goals at the top of the document so that people don't have to flip through. An alternate idea is to make 2 versions of the document, one for the moderator and one for stakeholders, without all the spacing and so forth. But actually later on, I'm going to suggest that you take notes in Excel anyway, so maybe you just don't want to, maybe you do want to do just one copy that's consolidated and not do the spacing version with the room to write notes, because we should be taking notes in computers, which I'll get to in a little bit. Pass conditions. This is an often overlooked practice of documenting the pass conditions. I think it's terribly important to list all of the pass conditions, or most of the pass conditions. And what do I mean by pass condition? It's the path that the participant takes clicking around the application or website or whatever to accomplish the task. And by listing out the pass conditions, we can easily document when the participant passes and fails. If we don't list out what all of these pass conditions are, then we're going to be arguing with people, oh, did they really pass that? Did they go down this path? No, if we document it right off the bat, we can say pass, fail, right off the bat and move on. No conversation needed. And the pass condition will depend on the overall task goal. You know, it may be to find a particular page on a website. It may be completing a transaction. It may be manipulating a document in such a way. So it's going to vary from task to task and interface to interface. But it's very important to write down those pass conditions. And then, as I mentioned earlier, use non-leading tasks. It's just overall good practice. And just a quick note about subtasks. Sometimes, especially on complex interfaces, a pass condition may be multiple steps. And I know that some of you are already thinking, hey, that sounds like a compound task. Compound task is essentially a 2-step task. But sometimes you can't separate it out. They have a full path to do in order to purchase this product, that sort of thing. So you also want to document the pass conditions of the subtasks. So, all right, did they fill in their personal information correctly? Did they do the shipping information correctly? These are all subtasks, and you want to copy that. Again, we want to get a granular data and document what the granular data is up front so that we're collecting the good data and being consistent about it. So getting to quantitative questions, everything we've talked about so far is fairly qualitative in nature, but quantitative questions are extremely important. Why is this? Well, frankly, overall, clients love numbers. They have weight, as opposed to us touchy-feely usability people who talk qualitative all the time. Quantitative really speaks to people. And in a typical think aloud usability study, where we only have 8 to 12 people, which is not enough people for statistical significance typically. And additionally, the think aloud protocol, where we're having the participants talk aloud as they're doing tasks and telling us what they're doing, it really kills the idea of using task time as a measure. Because we're expanding the task time artificially because they're talking the whole time. Task time is really best during a remote asynchronous study where there's no moderator, which is a whole other webinar. So we want to include this quantitative information, but we don't want to exaggerate. We don't want to exaggerate the data. We want to collect this faithfully and truthfully. So the best way to do this is really to have ratings, different ratings, either participant ratings or moderator ratings on different aspects of the website or the interactions. So you can use a Likert or a semantic scale, such as 1 through 7, like you're seeing in the upper right-hand corner here. Great way to collect quantitative data. And some suggestions here. First off, print out the scale and hang it somewhere, or have it on the desk so that participants can refer to it, and they don't have to ask you, whoa, what was the scale again? It makes it a lot easier if you print it out in big, bold letters, too. And you want to use the same scale throughout the study. Don't go changing the scale because that's going to throw off participants. And again, along those lines, make sure the scale stays in the same direction. What that means is, don't go swapping 1 and 7. So in this scale, 1 is very easy, 7 is very hard. In the next question, don't say, all right, now 1 is very hard and 7 is very easy. May seem obvious, but very important. Don't confuse users if you can. And regarding using an odd or even number scale, it's really a matter of personal preference. There's a lot of different research out there saying which one's better or not. Some people like to give participants the opportunity to choose a middle. I don't. So it's really just a matter of personal preference there. And a tip here is to use the same scale across different studies. So that way you can compare products over time. So look at different studies in comparison to each other if you're using the same scale. So some of the ratings, as I mentioned, participant ratings and observational measures. So what you can ask the participant, how easy was the task? How quickly do you think you performed the task? How useful is this feature? How likely are you to use this, or how likely are you to recommend this sort of thing. And again, same scales, 1 through 7, 1 through 5, whatever you like. But there's also observational measures that we can gather that can be done by moderators or observers. So task and subtask success, did they pass, did they fail? Fairly straightforward. What path did they take? And we can tally which was the most often used path and so forth. Did the participant need an additional explanation? Very important to know, because that will let us know, is this clearly shown on the application. And then the subjective moderator assessments, and I'm going to go into further detail here about that. So the moderator and the observers are in a real unique position to assess how well the tasks were completed. And so there's an opportunity here to give ratings on whether it was completed with problems, with hints, or with errors. So what we like to do is have this scale of, all right, they completed it with 1 or 2 hints or 2 or 3 hints, or they completed it with a couple of errors, that sort of thing. And this gives us some nice quantitative information that can add to the findings as well. And something that can be done here is finding the deltas, the differences between different observers' assessment, and then that may facilitate a conversation around a particular aspect of the interface. So going back to the root.com example, so this is just an example. We have the task goals up top, the task written right here, the pass condition, some moderators notes, and again, lots of space to write and circle answers, that sort of thing. And then just the bottom of that page with more writing, with more ratings and questions and so forth, more examples from the Moderator's Guide. Moving on to post-study questions. Again, you want to constrain these questions as best as possible to keep people on topic. And it's the opportunity to ask about the overall experience. What did they like? What did they dislike? And don't forget to ask those quantitative ratings. And you can use standardized scales, such as the system usability scale or the net promoter score, which can be compared across different studies and products. So that can be very useful. And some example questions, again, you want to keep it simple and constrained. So tell me 2 things that you liked or disliked, what's missing. And then the tell me about your overall experience question can be rather open-ended and invite tangents. So I like to constrain it with, all right, tell me about your overall experience in 30 seconds or less. So that way you keep them on track and you keep the study on track. Again, back to the root.com example with the follow-up questions. What's your overall impression? Here we have the overall experience rating and then the net promoter score rating. And then again, constrained questions. Would you look at this at home? What do you like best? What do you like least? And so forth. And I always like to end with, hey, do you have any final comments that I may not have asked you about? Because you know what? We don't ask every question that we should sometimes, and let the users tell us what we should be asking. So that's the bulk of the moderator. That's it for the Moderator's Guide. And let me just reiterate why I just spent so much time on the Moderator's Guide. By delineating out all of these data points that we're going to be collecting, we can consistently collect them across participants with the aid of a notes grid. and that's what I'm going to talk about here really briefly. So I like to use Excel spreadsheet to take notes in. It segments the data, it makes it nice and granular, and it standardizes note-taking behavior across different note takers. It gives note takers the same mental model for taking those notes. And moderators can get into a rhythm. Okay, I haven't asked this question yet. Let me go back. And what they can do is see a hole in that note grid and say, oh, I haven't asked that yet. So it helps moderators to make sure they ask all questions. Breaks it into the simplest granular data points, and it's easy to manipulate the quantitative data once you have that captured. And what do I mean by that? So here's an example of a notes grid. So what I like to do is have 3 columns per participant with their answer, either my comments or their comments, and then the opportunity to collect quotes. And then we segment it out into the pre-study, task 1, task 2, post-study, and so forth, and use numbers when possible. So for all these yes-no questions, 1s and 0s, because that will facilitate analyzing the quantitative data. And it's also nice for those independent assessments or the error assessment, you can add a comment that will have a pop-up and inform the moderator or note-taker what the scale actually is. So quickly here, as we're running out of time, just a few notes on conducting studies. So while you're note-taking, as I mentioned, I like to do it in a spreadsheet. Spreadsheets will keep you consistent. But some people do think that typing notes in the room with the participant can be distracting, but this can be minimized through good note-taking behavior. So, we don't want to non-verbally communicate disinterest, and that's what happens when you start typing typically. You're looking down at your computer and you're typing away. You want to maintain eye contact as best you can, because eye contact indicates interest. Same with stopping of typing. You stop typing, the participant's going to stop talking because they think that you have you're no longer interested in what they're saying. Meanwhile, you could have been typing about something they said a minute ago. So don't let that computer become a barrier. Situate it to the side, not in between you and the participant. Type softly. Don't let them hear you typing. Because let them do the task and talk away. Don't let them concentrate on the fact that you're typing away. And it does help to be a touch typist here, so you can maintain that eye contact and continue typing away. And if you're not a touch typist, don't do that, because you'll wind up with terrible notes because your fingers will be on the wrong keys or something like that. So really, look at the participant when you can. Give them nonverbal information that you're interested. And regarding participant comfort, there's really 2 main points here. Is that you want to match their tone of voice within reason, of course. If they're loud and boisterous, you don't want to be loud and boisterous. But if they are quiet and soft, you try to mimic their tone of voice in order to put them at ease. Again, within reason, you want to make sure that you're recorded and your voice isn't too low. And additionally, personal space. Different people have different personal space needs. So start with ample space, and then, if you have to move in to grab the mouse or something like that, just tell them that you're going to do that. There was once a participant who had very large personal space needs, and every time he went to go manipulate the prototype, he would just scoot away to the back of the wall until we moved back, and then he would move back. So it's very interesting, but people have different personal space needs, and we need to be cognizant of that because we are in the room with them. So in total here, the real key to collecting the consistent data is that moderator's guide. It aligns stakeholders with tasks, goals, and questions. It delineates those granular pieces of information to be collected and make sure that we collect those pieces of data across all the participants. And if we're doing a multiple study test, across the different studies as well. Notes grid in a spreadsheet gets you consistent notes. You can find those unasked questions so you don't miss anything, and it'll make for quick data entry and analysis. And, in our field, participant comfort is always paramount. We want to make sure that the participant is at ease and is willing to talk to us. So this is not only ethical, but, it leads to better data collection. It leads to better data in general. And that is the webinar. So with that, first off, if you have any questions beyond what's going to be asked right now, feel free to email me or contact me on Twitter. That's my email address and Twitter handle, Vanderlyn. And I would be remiss if I didn't remind everyone that in March is the Mad Pow and Claricode Healthcare Experience Design Conference. 2 days of workshops, 1 day of conference, and it's going to be a great thing. So with that, I'll see if we have any questions. Just give me 1 second, folks. I'm going to pull up the questions on my screen here. Okay, so we have a couple questions here, a couple of great questions, awesome. So first off, how do you decide what to ask in a pre-study versus in the background questions during the study? Do you make time to have the moderator read the pre-study before the participant enters? Well, the moderator should definitely be informed about the pre-study before the participant enters. Oh, I see what you're saying here, the pre-study questionnaire. Well, it is a good idea to leave a little time to review that if you can. That is a luxury, I believe. What I typically do is just kind of review it as I'm walking the participant back if it's not too in-depth. And regarding, how do you decide what to ask in pre-study versus background questions, really comes down to the really basics can be done in that questionnaire most easily. Anything that may facilitate conversation or warrant further explanation, those should probably be done in the room with the participant. Next question here. Let me see here. How do you balance using a moderator's guide versus making sure the system works for the user's natural workflow? Does this assume you've done work understanding the workflows ahead of time? Definitely. When we're making tasks, we want to make them as real world as possible. It goes back to that empathetic point that I made earlier. So yeah, we want that task to align with the natural workflow as best as possible. Now, sometimes that's not possible because of the prototype fidelity, and we'll have to talk through it. So sometimes we'll have to say, use your imagination. Sometimes we'll have to invoke the participant's momentary suspense of disbelief. But we do try to align the tasks with real world if possible. All right, going to some other questions here. Yep, so great question. And what if the moderator is new to the field and the interviewees are all experts, physicians, for instance? It's easy to miss important details. Absolutely. So as moderators, we're domain experts in usability, but we need to be we need to have all this other domain experience because we run studies in different areas. So this is really where the stakeholder interviews become very, very important, especially for complex products and concepts. As a moderator, you need to, and as a researcher in general, you need to get at what the, you need to find out from stakeholders what are the most important things here. And again, this is why we encourage observation, because the physicians or people with a lot of knowledge about some domain expertise may say something that a moderator may miss. So hopefully you have some observers who pick up on that, and that's really the best way to do it, is to encourage observation. Will the slide deck be made available? Yes. Nice, easy question. All right. Okay, I'm just looking through some more questions here. Just one moment. So while A/B testing, do you think it is better to have the participant perform all tasks for A and then move to B, or should they switch between A and B for each task? I'm a big fan of doing one prototype and then the other, the full prototype, because if you're switching between interfaces, you're essentially doing the same task twice, and I think that can, I think it can burn out participants, And B, you going back actually to the previous question of workflows, you want to capture that workflow if you can. If you're jumping between A and B, you're going to be interrupting that workflow, and that can be artificial. Okay. What's the best way to handle a situation where the participant gets lost during a task? Great question, because this always happens. So the way I typically handle that is through a series of hints. You really want to start off with small hints. Start off small and move your way up as needed. You don't want to tell the participant the link outright. You just want to give them small hints. If those small hints don't work, then move on to bigger hints and then tell them the answer and then talk about it. The best way is really just incremental hints. Okay, so I'm just reading some more questions here. Yeah, so when you have a task that references something, such as a link or a button, that's so specific that you find yourself tiptoeing around using these words, how do you deal with that, and do you have any specific examples? I can't give any specific examples off the cuff right now. I have to go digging into some examples. But so a study that we recently did, it was very domain-oriented. So it was very specific domain, and some of the links were unrewordable because it was domain specific, and sometimes you do just have to not tiptoe around it and say, all right, you want to use this type of feature, and that type of feature tells them what the link is. Sometimes you have to bite the bullet and just do that, and to see, are they finding it, and then really dig around the interaction. And again, that goes back to the overwording of things. You don't want to over-tiptoe around things because you can just completely obfuscate the task and cause confusion. Okay. So another one here, we like to have two researchers helping out with the study, as do we. One to moderate and one to observe in a separate room and to help out with technical issues. Great idea. Any downside to having the observer taking notes in the spreadsheet instead of the moderator? Any downside to having the observer taking notes in the spreadsheet instead of the moderator? I don't think so, because the idea is that we're using two different, so when you have an observer and a moderator, what we typically do is have two separate documents, one for person A and one for person B. And then at the end of the study, person A and B get together and marry up the documents and see where the alignments are, see where the disagreements are. And actually, those alignments and disagreements can be great data points, especially if you have more and more observers. So we typically handle that by bringing it together into one master sheet if possible, or we just keep them separate and refer to both of them. We've definitely run into that before. For the participant ratings, do you just ask those after each task, then one for overall? We moved kind of quickly through that, so any additional tips you have would be helpful. Yep. So, yeah, I have mixed feelings about asking the rating after each task. I feel that participants get burnt out really quickly from asking, hey, what would you rate this 1 through 5? Hey, what would you rate this 1 through 5? And just asking it over and over again. They get completely burnt out from it, and it's almost useless. If it's very important, then yeah, maybe you do. And if you're doing like an A/B study, that's really important. Or if you're doing a series of studies, that's important. But really, I like to rely on the overall at the very end. Some clients do want that rating at the end of each task, and then you do it. But I do feel that participants get burnt down on it very easily. Do you utilize the same scale, 1 through 7, when communicating to the client the severity of issues that arise from the test? I don't. So the rating scale that we use, either 1 through 7, 1 through 5, whatever you wind up using, That's really for the ratings, and we do report that directly to the client, sure. That's great quantitative information, and for those ratings, we'll report it directly. But when it comes to the severity of issues, that's a whole other ball of wax, because there's a lot of debate in the field as to what scale should be used to indicate the severity of the issue. I'm a big fan of the one that indicates about data loss. A severity 1 problem is one that where the user loses data, and that can be terribly frustrating. But there are different scales out there, and that's a matter of choice, really. Okay. What differences, if any, would you suggest in how tasks are presented if you are doing testing on a live website versus a prototype? Honestly, I wouldn't make that much of a difference. You want to treat the prototype like the real deal. So anything that you find out about it not being a real deal, then that's a good data point. So honestly, I would suggest having no difference between those wordings. You may have to walk around areas that aren't functioning quite yet, and you may want to keep that in mind when making the task. But overall, no, I would say those are similar or the same. Do you have any tips for moderating physicians? That's a great one. Well, they are the experts, and you need to be very cognizant of that. With physicians, you never want to tell them something that you think they may need to hear or they want to hear or something like that. So maybe, they want to be the ones doing the talking. So basically, you want to keep the physicians talking as much as humanly possible, asking pointed questions, and if you have any domain expertise, you really want to take a step back and let them own the show. That's really the piece of advice I have with moderating physicians. They are the expert, and treat them as such. With regard to a successful task, do you measure time on task also? What measurement is considered successful? I never measure time on task unless we're doing an asynchronous, unmoderated study, and using a service such as User Zoom or Loop 11, that sort of thing, where there's no moderator and there's no think aloud. That's the only time, in my humble opinion, that time on task is useful, because otherwise they're going to keep talking, and then the data won't be consistent across participants. What measure is considered successful? Well, it's really just a matter of pass-fail of the pass condition. Did they get to this pass condition? If so, then that's a pass. Did they get to the pass? And that's where the independent assessment really is important, because they may have passed, but they may have floundered through it, and you want to capture that data. So mark it as a pass, but back in the independence assessment, mark it as like a 3 or a 4. They passed it, but with like 5 hints, that sort of thing. Okay, and we have one last question here. Let's say take a sip of tea, of course. Okay, this is a fun one. Do you have any tips for conducting studies with participants who aren't in the same room with you, through WebEx, et cetera? Are there tools you prefer for this? Actually, we run a lot of studies through WebEx and remote. Because it's cost efficient, you can get a wider geographic distribution without plane travel. And if you have a very specific recruit, you're not constrained to one geographic location. So I actually use WebEx. I think it's a very powerful tool for doing this, and it is great. I do think the audio is a little clearer on WebEx than on GoToMeeting, but I've heard the flip side of that as well, so that may be a matter of personal preference. And so when you're dealing with WebEx, you want to give them as much information as possible in the invitation email, So the best thing to do really is to have them set up the WebEx Meeting Center beforehand. In WebEx, there's typically a link that you can send to have the participants set up WebEx beforehand, because you don't want to spend the first 5-10 minutes on the phone with them troubleshooting WebEx, believe me. So yeah, get them going beforehand if you can. And something that I like to do with WebEx is to have one all-day session in WebEx and keep it running all day. But you can still capture recordings for each individual session. So, you hit record at the beginning of the day, and then you can stop recording. Stopping recording will not stop your session. So you can make individual recordings through WebEx, and that's very powerful. The only caveat about that is that you need a PC to transcode the video from the proprietary WebEx format to WMV. And that piece of software is not Mac compliant. So if you're a Mac shop, you may not want to use WebEx. And that should do it. Everyone, I really appreciate you taking the time to listen in here. I hope you got something out of this. And again, don't hesitate to contact me, and here's my contact information again. Don't hesitate to contact me if you have any further questions.
Super. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Just to let you know, the slides will be available under the event section on Mad Pow site. We'll have that available to you shortly. I'll also be emailing everyone the slides after this as well. Like Dan said, if you have any questions, feel free to either contact webinars@madpow.net or Dan Berlin. And thanks for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.